So, Director Peters, how do you determine whether it's a few bad apples versus a culture of abuse? I mean, how do you make that determination systemically? You know, obviously, when you've got the warden and the chaplain, you kind of figure that's probably a culture. But again, you've got a number of facilities. How do you make that determination?
Thank you, Senator. I think that the Bureau is now putting together cultural assessments where we have teams who are trained to come in and assess that culture. I think some of the signs are absolutely, Senator, like you said, when it's high-level officials engaging in this egregious criminal acts, there's clearly a culture. But also when you find those who are incarcerated who openly tell our cultural assessment team that they don't feel comfortable coming forward. They don't feel like there are avenues to report in a way where they can report without fear of reprisal. And it's those sorts of warning signs that we want to be able to find during these cultural assessments so that we don't have a Dublin repeat again, and so that those individuals in our care and custody are safe. And so we look forward to continuing those cultural assessments and ensuring that we are taking all of that data into account.
Do you have any idea in terms of how somebody who's being sexually abused inside a prison can report that without having a very legitimate fear of retaliation or reprisal? Can you think of anything? Understanding you have a hotline, well, they'll know they're using the hotline. You provide confidential communication, well, that'll be abused by drug traffickers. I mean, it's tough not to crack. Do you have any possible ideas of what might work?
Thank you, Senator, and I appreciated those questions directly to those who are formerly incarcerated and now victims of these egregious acts that you asked earlier this morning. I think that the answer is there has to be many avenues. First, we have to create a culture where they have developed relationships with the frontline officers and they do feel comfortable talking to them. When absent that, we have to develop a culture where family members and loved ones know that they too can report internally or externally. And I think the key, and as we listened to the women talk this morning, that ability to report independently without any tracking from the Bureau directly to the Inspector General's office is a key component of being able to crack that nut.
Yeah, but again, they're in prison. How can they report without people knowing? And then let's face it, they report in, after a certain amount of time, all of a sudden, people are asking questions. I mean,
that's right. And so right now, the way they can report directly to the Inspector General without us knowing is through true links. So they're able to send an email directly to the Inspector General outlining their allegations and their concerns. And you're absolutely right. Then investigators come, Senator, and questions are asked. And so the information is inside the institution. And so it can't just be reporting alone. It has to be things like the convictions that we're seeing out of California so that our Bureau employees know that if they engage in this type of behavior or engage in acts of reprisal, that they will be held accountable. And I think that level of prosecution and accountability will allow us over time to develop an environment where individuals can come forward without that fear of reprisal.
In the PREA audits, how many inmates are what percentage of the inmates are questioned during those things in a confidential manner?
Senator, I do not know the answer to that question.
Okay, I mean, that would certainly be one way, a more all-inclusive survey, surveillance audits, that type of thing. How many personnel do you have in the Office of Internal Affairs?
I don't know the total number, but I do know that we just added more than 40 positions to the Office of Internal Affairs in order to help us.
So it's probably in the hundreds?
Yeah.
Inspector General Horowitz, do you know?
I don't know the exact number in the BOP's operations. I do think I'd be guessing. I'm not sure exactly how many they have in their internal affairs. As I said, we have about 113 agents around the country devoting about half their time to this. And if I could answer that, I think you've hit on, as you talked about in the first panel, a critically important question. As Director Peters said, there is this ability to send an email directly to us that is anonymized, that cannot be traced. The question, of course, is who's watching over people's shoulders when that occurs? Where's the terminal? what happens when we respond, because obviously we want to respond, so that has to be addressed. But I think one of the things that's critically important is the culture question we've been talking about, because as you know from having run a business, the question is, why aren't the employees stepping forward? Why do we need the inmates and only the inmates to step forward? It's a very serious problem. We have the warden, a chaplain, and many other employees at the Dublin prison. We could talk about Brooklyn, MDC Brooklyn. We could talk about MCC New York. We could talk about FCI Atlanta. We could talk about Thompson Prison. We can keep going, right? Why aren't those employees coming forward when they've got a predator among their fellow employees? They're the first line. They're the eyes and ears, along with the inmates. They're the ones who need to come forward. There needs to be that ability and accountability for people who are responsible and for people who should have come forward, including supervisors.
Director Peters, I know just local law enforcement, for a host of reasons, are having a very difficult time recruiting. You know, the defund police movement, the blame cops first, that type of thing. What kind of recruitment issues are you having within the Bureau of Prisons?
Thank you for the question, Senator. First, I can't agree more with what the Inspector General just said. Our employees have an obligation to come forward. And I think it ties directly into your next question, which is how do we hire the right people to come in who want to change hearts and minds, who want to do the right thing, who have those core values, who have those ethics. And if ever there was a time where it was difficult to hire at the Bureau of Prisons, it's now, for all the reasons you just mentioned, Senator. It was difficult to hire before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit and made these jobs even less attractive, as well as the other issues that you just raised in the field of law enforcement. And so one of our top priorities is recruitment and retention strategies, and we've been working diligently internal with the Bureau, but we've also reached out to 2 organizations and contracted with them in hopes that we can rely on their expertise to improve our ability to hire not just people, but the right people for this business.
So if you'll indulge me for one more point, maybe question, there is a real problem of false reports, correct? Do you either of you have any indication of how significant a problem that is? I mean, let's face it, you are talking about people who have committed crimes. Some of them maybe aren't the most honorable or most honest, and not a bad way to retaliate against a guard either. So that it's how do you know, how does Bureau of Prisons, how does Office of Internal Affairs, how does Office of Inspector General try and sift through the true claims versus the fraudulent ones?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, Senator. It's something actually, having done police corruption cases back when I was a federal prosecutor in New York, was one of the key questions also, which is you had a lot of allegations against the bad cops, but you had allegations against the good cops because the drug dealers knew that was a convenient way, or thought it was at least, to impact them. And so you have to be very careful as investigators to understand that. And frankly, the only way you do it is by getting the complaints, carefully vetting them, and not jumping to a conclusion. And that's one of the challenges we face also, particularly because it's so challenging to get into the prison to see if there's corroboration. And this is where cameras come in. Cameras are, I could talk about this for days. It's not only on sexual abuse, it's on assaults in prison. How many times do we get a complaint that an inmate was assaulted by another correctional officer? A lot of those are false because they had an injury and it was their own doing. We don't have a camera. There's no excuse for that, none whatsoever.
So, by the way, I completely agree with that, and that is just table stakes. That that has to be fixed. The cameras have to be fixed. They've got to be provide as much as possible 100% coverage. That would take care of an awful lot of this. And in the scheme of things, probably one of the most cost-effective ways of really addressing this. So,
you're 1,000% right.
Thank you, Ranking Member Johnson. I would note as a point of personal privilege, Senator Langford, that Senator Grassley and I have the Prison Camera Reform Act. It's passed the Senate unanimously, and any help that everybody in this room can muster getting that through the House before this Congress ends would be deeply appreciated.